The first time the HOA fined me $50,000, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, though in its absurdity it kind of was, but because I couldn't imagine a group of middle-aged retirees in pastel golf shirts seriously believing they had the power to bankrupt me over a pile of concrete, dirt, and steel holding back a reservoir. But there it was, stamped with official letterhead, signed by Roland, the HOA president, and delivered by certified mail like a royal decree. The letter read like something from a dictator's desk. You are hereby ordered to dismantle the unauthorized dam structure located on your property. Failure to comply will result in continued fines totaling $50,000. No explanation, no negotiation, no acknowledgement of the fact that this so-called unauthorized structure was the only reason their manicured streets weren't already Venice canals every spring. That morning, I stood in my kitchen with the letter pinned under a trout-shaped magnet on the fridge, coffee in hand, staring at it like it was a piece of bad modern art. 50 grand. For a dam that not only kept my land safe, but theirs as well. I built the dam 5 years ago after moving back to the valley. The old culverts and drainage ditches couldn't handle the seasonal runoff anymore, and every storm left the neighborhood downstream swamp. The county didn't have the budget for infrastructure upgrades, and the HOA certainly didn't. So I did what my father would have done. I built something with my own 2 hands. Reinforced concrete, steel supports, a simple spillway, nothing fancy but strong enough to hold back a storm. The result was a calm reservoir on my property and dry basements on theirs. But here's the thing about HOAs. They don't care about dry basements. They care about aesthetics, about community standards, about whether your lawn has one too many dandelions or your mailbox is painted the wrong shade of beige. My dam wasn't in their handbook, so in their minds it wasn't just wrong, it was defiance. The fine wasn't just money. It was a message. We control this neighborhood, not you. I wasn't new to messages like that. 22 years in the army, most of them overseas, had taught me what power looks like in the wrong hand. Sometimes it's a uniform and a rifle. Sometimes it's a clipboard and a gavel. The tactics are the same: make you bend, make you break, make you comply. But they didn't know me. Not yet. The first confrontation came at an HOA meeting. I hadn't planned on going. I'd avoided them since the day I moved in, knowing full well I didn't fit the mold of retirees comparing azalea bushes. But after the letter, I wanted to see their faces when they tried to justify it. The clubhouse smelled of cheap carpet cleaner and coffee gone stale. A dozen residents sat in folding chairs, papers rustling as Roland cleared his throat at the podium. Square-shouldered, gray hair slicked back, he had the air of a man who believed rules were holy writ. Item 3 on the agenda, he announced. Unauthorized dam structure. Every head turned to me. Whispers flitted through the room like gnats. I raised my hand slowly, as if I were back in school. Yes, Roland said, his voice already dripping with annoyance. Curious how my dam is unauthorized when it's on private land and prevents your streets from turning into rivers every spring, I said. A hush fell. Someone coughed. A woman in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Roland adjusted his glasses. It is unsightly. It disrupts the natural aesthetic of the neighborhood. And it was not approved by this board. I leaned back in my chair. So what you're saying is, you'd prefer kayaks on Cedar Lane to a view you don't like? Murmurs rippled. Roland banged his gavel. This is not a debate. The board has voted. The fines will stand. That was it. No discussion, no compromise. Just their will imposed on mine. I walked out without another word. But as I left, I noticed something. A man in the back, Dennis, my neighbor, smiled faintly, like he'd been waiting years for someone to stand up to Roland. Outside, he caught up with me. Wiry, mid-60s, always chewing sunflower seed. You sure stirred the pot in there, he said, grinning. They're the ones poking the bear, I replied. He spat a shell onto the pavement. Careful. That bear's got claws. But I wasn't worried. I'd faced bigger claws. 2 days later, the next letter arrived. More fines. More threats of liens, lawsuits, and emergency action. I pinned it next to the first one on my fridge, poured another coffee, and smiled. If they wanted a war, I wasn't the type to blink first. That week, I started noticing the patrols. Carol from the compliance committee, visor perched perfectly, clipboard clutched like a shield, walking the edge of my property and scribbling note. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. Just scrawled furiously as though the weeds in my ditch were weapons of mass destruction. When I asked what she was writing, she sniffed. Documenting violations. Take a picture, I told her. It'll last longer. She did. By Friday, the HOA had added new infractions. Grass too tall, unapproved fencing material, suspicious storage of equipment. Suspicious storage? My tractor wasn't a meth lab. It was a tractor. But they weren't after truth. They were after control. I played it cool, but inside, I was sharpening something invisible. Patience. Patience is a blade most people don't see until it's already cut them. The first storm rolled in a week later. Clouds stacked like artillery shells, thunder shaking the valley, rain hammering roofs and swelling the creek. Normally, my dam slowed the water, held it back like a quiet hand on chaos. But that night, I opened the sluice just a little wider than usual, enough to remind them what lay downstream. By dawn, Cedar Lane was an ankle-deep river. Lawns drowned, mailboxes leaned sideways, and Roland was out there in boots, shouting orders as though yelling could turn back water. I stood at my fence with a thermos of coffee and watched. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. The next morning, another letter arrived. This one wasn't polite. Not a fine, not a threat. A summons. The HOA was suing me for endangerment of community property. They wanted damages, attorney fees, and an injunction to dismantle the dam. I pinned that one to the fridge too. The collection was starting to look like modern art. That night, Dennis came by again, shaking his head. They're going to bleed you dry, he warned. They'll bury you in paper until you give in. Maybe, I said. Or maybe they're digging their own grave. He frowned. What do you mean? I just smiled. Patience. Because I knew something Roland didn't. The county had signed off on my dam years ago. It was legal, functional, and the only thing standing between his cul-de-sac kingdom and disaster. He could throw all the paper at me he wanted, but when the rain fell, the truth wasn't written in bylaws. It was written in water. And water doesn't care about clipboards. The first HOA meeting I attended after the fine was a circus disguised as order. Picture a dozen retirees in polo shirts and khakis, sipping bottled water like it was holy wine, while a projector flickered slides of bylaws they'd memorized better than scripture. The president, a square-shouldered man named Roland who always smelled like menthol cough drops, leaned into the microphone like he was addressing the United Nations. He tapped his finger on the agenda. Item 3. Unauthorized dam structure. $50, 000 fine. He said it the way an executioner announces the beheading, without even looking at me. I raised my hand like a school kid and waited. A few heads turned. One woman adjusted her visor as though sunlight were pouring in from the fluorescent bulbs. Roland sighed. Yes. Curious, I said, keeping my voice casual, how my dam is unauthorized when it's on private land and prevents all your lovely decorative streets from turning into rivers every spring. The silence was sweet. A cough rattled from the back row. Then came the scraping of folding chairs as people shifted uncomfortably. Roland adjusted his glasses. The structure is unsightly. It disrupts the natural aesthetic. It was never approved. I could have argued engineering, flood prevention, or the fact that the county signed off on it years ago. But instead, I tilted my head. You know what's unsightly? Kayaks floating down Cedar Lane. Or basements that smell like dead carp. But maybe that's just me. Gasps and whispers flared up, but Roland banged his gavel like a man trying to kill a stubborn beetle. This is not a debate. The board has voted. Of course they had. They'd voted long before I walked in. This wasn't about bylaws. It was about power. My dam sat at the edge of their curated world, a reminder that not everything bent to clipboards and fines. Roland wanted control, and the dam was one thing he didn't have his fingerprints on. I walked out without another word, leaving the taste of sarcasm behind like cigarette smoke. My neighbor, Dennis, caught up with me in the parking lot. He was a wiry man in his 60s, always chewing sunflower seeds and spitting them like punctuation. "You really poked the bear in there," he said, grinning with half his teeth. "Let them roar," I replied. But roaring was only the start. 2 days later, I got the first letter. Certified mail, embossed letterhead, signed by Roland himself. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression. Failure to comply, escalating penalties, potential legal action. The kind of thing that looked official enough to scare most people into folding. I pinned it to my fridge with a magnet shaped like a trout and poured myself coffee. Let them play their game. I'd spent enough years overseas to know something they didn't. Patience isn't weakness. Patience is a blade you sharpen quietly. By the end of the week, they escalated. A woman named Carol from the compliance committee showed up at my property, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. She walked the fence line, scribbling notes furiously, her lips pursed so tight I thought they might fuse shut. When I asked what she was doing, she said, "Documenting violations." "Take a picture, it'll last longer," I told her. She snapped one, just to prove a point. I wasn't surprised when the next letter included new infractions. Weeds over 6 inches, unapproved fencing material, suspicious storage of equipment. Suspicious storage? That one made me laugh out loud. My tractor wasn't a meth lab, it was a tractor. But in their eyes, anything they didn't control was suspect. Dennis came by again, shaking his head. "They're gonna bleed you dry," he warned. 50 grand is just the start. They'll tack on every violation until you're buried. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe they're digging their own grave." That was when the first storm rolled in. Black clouds stacked like artillery shells, thunder shaking the valley. Rain hammered the roofs, poured into gutters, and filled the creek. Normally, my dam slowed the runoff, held it back like a patient hand keeping chaos in check. But this time, I opened the sluice just a little, enough to let them glimpse the future they were begging for. By dawn, Cedar Lane had an ankle-deep river cutting through its manicured lawns. A mailbox leaned sideways, clinging to its post like a drunk after a long night. Roland himself was out there in boots, barking orders as if he could yell the water back uphill. I stood by my fence, coffee steaming in my hand, and watched. Not a word passed my lips. Sometimes silence is louder than any speech. The next morning, the letters stopped being polite. They weren't fines anymore, they were threats. Legal action, liens, removal of property. It was war in stationary form. But here's the thing about war. You don't win it by firing the first shot. You win it by making the enemy think they're in control while you quietly rig the battlefield. I called the county office, double-checked my permits, and confirmed what I already knew. My dam was legal. The HOA couldn't touch it unless I let them. Still, the fines piled up on paper, and with each one, I imagined the exact moment I'd cash them in for payback. I wasn't in a rush. Patience, remember? The real twist came when I got a knock at the door. Not Carol with her clipboard, not Roland with his menthol breath. This time, it was a man in a county engineer's vest, mud still drying on his boot. He introduced himself as Mark, said he'd been asked by the HOA to inspect my dam. "Official inspection?" I asked. He nodded. "They think it's unsafe. That it could collapse." I almost laughed. Funny. Without it, their houses collapse. Mark scratched his head. "Honestly, from what I've seen, this dam is the only reason that subdivision hasn't washed into the bay. You sure you want me to file a report?" That's when I knew the HOA had overplayed their hand. They weren't just annoying me, they were annoying the county. And counties don't like lawsuit. I leaned against the doorframe. File what you think is right. I'll wait. Mark grinned like he'd been waiting for someone to say that all day. Then I'll file the truth. When he left, I realized something. The HOA thought they were drowning me in paper. But what they didn't know was that every drop of rain, every storm cloud, every rivulet of runoff was writing my story for me. They'd handed me the pen the moment they called my dam an eyesore. And I was just getting started. When the county inspector filed his report, it didn't just land on Roland's desk. It detonated there. I know this because the man stormed over to my property the next morning, fists clenched, cheeks the color of a ripe tomato. He didn't knock. He banged on my door like it owed him money. "Do you think this is funny?" he shouted the second I opened it. I sipped my coffee and raised an eyebrow. "Depends. Are we talking about your tie choice or something else?" Roland shoved a stack of papers at me, the edges already crumpled from his grip. "Your dam, your ridiculous monstrosity, was ruled compliant. Do you understand what this means? The county is siding with you. Against the HOA." His voice cracked on the last word, as if betrayal were personal. Like the government had cheated on him. I scanned the papers lazily. Looks like the county thinks the dam prevents floods. Imagine that. Science wins again. Roland's jaw twitched. "This isn't over. We will appeal." "Of course you will," I said, handing the papers back. "Just like a gambler doubling down after losing his mortgage. Best of luck." He stormed off, muttering about bylaws and aesthetics, while his shiny SUV sprayed gravel out of my driveway. I watched him go, thinking how fragile power looks when it's cornered. For a few blissful days, the neighborhood simmered in quiet resentment. No letters, no clipboard patrols, just dirty looks when I drove past. I almost believed they were retreating. Then came the newsletter. Folded neatly in every mailbox, it declared me a danger to community safety and urged residents to contribute to a legal defense fund to rid the neighborhood of unauthorized hazards. They didn't mention my name directly, but they didn't need to. The illustration of a cracked dam with cartoon waves drowning suburban houses got the point across. Dennis waved his copy at me like a white flag on fire. "They're coming for you harder than ever," he said. I shrugged. Let them. But inside, I was sharpening that blade of patience again. The newsletter proved they weren't just after compliance, they were after control. And control addicts always escalate. The escalation arrived in the form of Carol. Clipboard queen, visor perfectly adjusted, perfume strong enough to fumigate a barn. She caught me mowing my lawn and marched right up as if she owned the deed. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed. "On a good day, sure," I said over the roar of the mower. She shoved another letter at me, this one threatening emergency action, if the dam wasn't removed within 30 days. "You will bankrupt yourself fighting us." I killed the mower and leaned on the handle. "Maybe. Or maybe you'll bankrupt yourselves chasing something you can't win. Have you considered that possibility?" Her nostrils flared. She spun on her heel and stomped off, heels sinking in the soft ground like angry steak. That night, I sat on my porch, the dam's silhouette dark against the moonlit water. It had become more than an engineering project. It was a line in the sand. They wanted it gone because it was mine, not theirs. Because it represented something they couldn't dictate. The next storm came a week later. This time I didn't just loosen the sluice. I closed it tight, let the reservoir swell and groan, then opened it just enough at the peak to send a calculated surge downstream. Not enough to endanger anyone, but enough to remind them that without my dam, nature didn't ask permission. By morning, Maple Drive looked like a Venice canal. Children floated plastic toys in the current while their parents frantically bailed out garages with buckets. Roland was knee-deep in water, barking orders like a general watching his troops desert. I stood at the edge of my property, thermos in hand, and offered a friendly wave. "Nice weather we're having." His glare could have boiled the river dry. That afternoon, I received an official summons. The HOA was suing me for willful endangerment of community property. $50,000 wasn't enough anymore. They wanted damages, attorney fees, and an injunction to dismantle the dam immediately. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Then I called my lawyer. See, unlike them, I planned ahead. The moment the first fine arrived, I'd retained an attorney named Ruth. Sharp as a razor, voice like gravel, and a record of dismantling HOAs for sport. She loved nothing more than turning petty power trips into courtroom confetti. When I handed her the summons, she chuckled. They've got nothing. If this goes to trial, they'll drown in their own arguments. That's the idea, I said. The lawsuit lit the neighborhood like gasoline. Half the residents sided with the board, terrified of their lawns turning into ponds. The other half whispered that maybe, just maybe, the dam was the only thing saving their basements. Lines were drawn. Barbecues became awkward. Book clubs split down the middle. Even Dennis stopped coming by, afraid of picking the wrong side publicly. Meanwhile, the storms kept coming. And each time, the choice was mine. Keep the sluice closed, let the reservoir bulge, then release just enough to prove a point. I never endangered them, never would. But I let them taste fear. Fear is a persuasive tutor. Roland, though, wasn't learning. He doubled down. Flyers, door-to-door petitions, even a rally on the clubhouse lawn where he thundered about unsightly structures and irresponsible neighbors. I didn't attend, but I heard the shouts from my porch. Sound carries on wet night. Ruth prepped me for deposition like a prizefighter. Keep calm, answer directly, never show them your hand, she coached. I've been doing that since day one, I told her. The deposition was a theater of absurdity. Roland slammed his fist on the table. Carol sniffed dramatically every time I spoke, and their lawyer tried to paint me as some rogue survivalist stockpiling water like doomsday gold. I answered every question calmly, even when they bordered on ridiculous. Why did you construct the dam without HOA approval? Because it's not on HOA property. Do you deny the dam is unsightly? Depends. Some people think Roland's polo shirts are unsightly, but I don't file lawsuits about it. Even the court reporter smirked. When it ended, Ruth leaned over and whispered, "They're unraveling. Keep steady." She was right. But I didn't want them just unraveling. I wanted them to trip over their own threads until they strangled themselves. And that's when I made the decision that would push everything over the edge. If they wanted the dam gone so badly, if they wanted to bankrupt me and prove their power, I would give them exactly what they were asking for. On my terms. The idea came one night while listening to the rain drum the roof. The dam was more than concrete and earth. It was leverage. And leverage only works when you choose when to pull the pin. So I started planning. When I decided to give them what they wanted, it wasn't surrender. It was strategy. A soldier doesn't drop his weapon because the enemy demands it. He drops it because he's already planted explosives under their feet. Removing the dam wasn't the end of the war, it was the detonation. The plan started with a phone call to Ruth. They want it gone? I asked. Fine. We'll let them have it. Publicly. With county permits, paperwork, and witnesses. There was a pause, then a laugh that sounded like gravel in a blender. You're going to hand them their own funeral. Exactly. So we filed the paperwork. A formal request to dismantle a private dam, citing pressure from the HOA. Every page was copied, notarized, and sent to the county office. Transparency was the key. I wanted every bureaucrat in the valley to know this wasn't my idea. It was theirs. News travels fast in neighborhoods where gossip is a blood sport. Within a week, whispers turned into shouts. Carol strutted down sidewalks like a general after victory, telling anyone who'd listen that community order had prevailed. Roland gave speeches in the clubhouse about how persistence had defeated reckless defiance. And I smiled through it all, never correcting them, never reminding them of the storms that hadn't swept their houses into the river. Yet, when demolition day came, the county sent a crew. Big trucks, backhoes, men in hard hats. Neighbors lined the street like it was a parade. Some clapped. Some filmed on their phones, eyes glittering with vindication. Kids sat on bikes, watching the spectacle of authority crushing rebellion. I stood at the fence, coffee in hand, and raised my thermos in salute as the machines bit into the dam. The first crack echoed like a gunshot across the valley. Water surged forward in a foamy roar, rushing downstream with a force nobody in the HOA had ever seen unrestrained. Roland clapped his hands together once, as though sealing the victory. "Good riddance," he said loudly enough for half the crowd to hear. I didn't respond. I just thought about patience, about how sometimes you have to let people dig their own graves with the golden shovels they think are crowns. By the time the sun dipped low, the dam was rubble. The reservoir shrank to a trickle, its strength unleashed and scattered. What had been a barrier, a shield, was now just dirt and broken concrete. The HOA members celebrated with lemonade on Carol's lawn, toasting their triumph as though they'd slain a dragon. That night, thunder rolled in. I didn't sleep much. Not because I was nervous. I'd seen this storm building for weeks. The clouds had that green-black tint, the kind that makes the air heavy and still. When the first drops fell, I sat on my porch and waited, listening to the roof hum under the rain. By midnight, the creek had swollen beyond its bank. Without the dam's slow release, the water rushed downhill like an army with no break. Culverts clogged, storm drains overflowed, and lawns turned into swamps. By 2 a.m., Cedar Lane was under water. Driveways disappeared, cars bobbed like toys, and water lapped at front doors. I could hear Roland shouting orders even above the thunder, his voice desperate now, stripped of its arrogance. By dawn, the neighborhood looked like a disaster movie. Mailboxes were submerged. Garden gnomes floated past like tiny survivors. A minivan sat half-sunk at an angle, hazard lights blinking uselessly. Families stood on porches, staring out at the water that had swallowed their carefully curated world. I walked down to the edge of my property, dry and untouched thanks to its higher elevation, and watched. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Carol waded past in knee-deep water, visor dripping, mascara streaked like war paint. She glared at me with such venom I thought she might drown herself just to spite me. "This is your fault," she screamed. I raised my coffee mug. "Correction. This is your idea." Roland slogged up behind her, his khakis plastered to his legs, eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. "We'll rebuild," he shouted, voice cracking like a broken trumpet. "Be my guest," I said. The county trucks arrived by noon, not to rebuild but to assess damage. Engineers shook their heads, muttering about the obvious. Without the dam, the subdivision was a bowl collecting every drop of runoff. The reports would be scathing, I knew. Insurance claims would spiral into lawsuits, and the HOA would be exposed for forcing the destruction of the only structure that kept their streets dry. Dennis appeared, trudging through the muck, sunflower seeds clutched in one soggy hand. "They're saying you sabotaged it," he warned, voice low. I shrugged. "Let them. Paperwork says otherwise." And it did. Every county file, every permit, every signed request traced back to them. If they wanted to accuse me, they'd have to admit they orchestrated the demolition. The beauty of patience is that it leaves fingerprints exactly where you want them. That night, the HOA emergency meeting was held in the flooded clubhouse. Folding chairs sat in puddles, and the smell of mildew already lingered. Roland tried to rally the crowd, voice hoarse as he blamed unforeseen circumstances and county incompetence. But the residents weren't buying it. They shouted back, demanding to know why the dam had been removed at all. Carol stood up and tried to shift the blame to me. "He never should have built it in the first place," she cried. "Then why did you fight so hard to tear it down?" someone shouted back. Voices rose, fingers pointed, alliances crumbled. The same people who toasted lemonade on Carol's lawn now accused her of destroying their homes. And in the middle of it all, Roland's gavel cracked against the table, desperate to restore order to a ship already sinking. I didn't attend, of course. I just heard about it later from Dennis, who couldn't stop laughing. They turned on each other like wolves. Roland nearly got punched in the jaw. I smiled. Told you. Patience. But I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. This was only the beginning. Floodwaters recede, but anger lingers. Insurance companies were circling like vultures, neighbors were suing neighbors, and the HOA was cracking under its own hypocrisy. I didn't need to swing a hammer or hire a lawyer. All I had to do was stand still while their empire washed away around them. When the storm finally cleared, the neighborhood was scarred. Piles of ruined furniture sat curbside, drywall warped and buckling, lawns coated in silt. The once pristine streets looked like a battlefield after retreat. And through it all, one truth hung in the air heavier than the smell of mold. The dam had been their enemy only until it was gone. Now, its absence was the real monster. I rebuilt my fence that week, replacing the old boards with stronger posts. As I hammered nails into fresh wood, I could feel eyes on me from across the flooded lawns. Some were filled with anger, some with regret, and a few, just a few, with quiet respect. The HOA wasn't dead yet, but it was bleeding. And I knew the final blows were coming, not from me, but from the chaos they themselves had unleashed. Patience, after all, is about timing. And I was still waiting. The flood didn't vanish overnight. Water receded, sure, but the damage was carved deep into every cul-de-sac and manicured lawn like a scar that wouldn't fade. You can fix drywall, you can replace carpet, but you can't erase the memory of watching your living room fill up like a fish tank while your self-appointed leaders cheered on the demolition that caused it. The HOA tried spin control. Roland sent out an emergency newsletter printed on soggy paper, blaming historic rainfall and unpredictable weather patterns. He even quoted a local meteorologist, twisting the man's words until it sounded like the storm had been a once-in-a-century act of God. The problem was, everyone had eyes. They'd all seen storms before. None of them had watched their furniture float past their front porches until the dam came down. I kept quiet. That was the hardest part. Every cell in my body wanted to rub their noses in it, to point at the wreckage and say, "Told you so." But patience isn't about satisfying your impulses. It's about waiting until silence itself becomes louder than any speech. It didn't take long for the lawsuits to begin. Insurance companies aren't sentimental, and they aren't stupid. They looked at the county records, saw who requested the demolition, and laughed the homeowners right out of the claims office. Negligence, they called it. Self-inflicted damage. That phrase spread through the neighborhood like a virus. Self-inflicted. Two words that turned every angry glance away from me and squarely onto the HOA board. By the end of the first week, 5 families had filed civil suits against the HOA. By the second, a dozen more joined. Carol was seen leaving the clubhouse with her visor tilted low, clutching a stack of legal notices like they were radioactive. Dennis told me Roland's phone was ringing so often he stopped answering. At the grocery store, I started noticing something new. People who used to glare at me now avoided eye contact entirely, their shame heavier than their anger. A few even muttered thanks under their breath, as though admitting what they knew was true might curse them further. But not everyone was cowed. Roland, stubborn as a cornered bull, doubled down. He convened another emergency meeting, this time inviting the local press. He wanted to frame himself as a victim of circumstance, a leader unfairly scapegoated by ungrateful residents. I didn't plan on attending, but Ruth, my lawyer, insisted. Better to be there, say nothing, and let him bury himself, she advised. So I sat in the back, arms folded, while Roland thundered at the podium. His voice shook with desperation. We acted in good faith. We acted to protect property values, to preserve the character of our neighborhood. How could we have known such catastrophic weather would follow? Cameras clicked. Pens scratched on notepads. The residents muttered angrily among themselves. Then a man in the front row stood up. His name was Alan, father of 3, whose basement had collapsed in the flood. His voice cracked with fury. You knew exactly what would happen. He told you. Alan pointed straight at me. The room turned, hundreds of eyes boring into me. Roland seized the chance. Yes. There's the saboteur. He manipulated this entire situation. His dam was a threat, his dam was dangerous, and when it failed, I rose slowly, calm as a man getting up to stretch his legs. Correction, I said. My dam didn't fail. You demolished it. At your request. With county approval. In front of your neighbors. And now your houses are full of river water instead of furniture. The silence was delicious. The kind of silence where even reporters forget to take note. Roland slammed the gavel so hard it splintered. This meeting is adjourned, he barked, voice shrill. But the damage was done. Not to me, to him. The next day, the local paper ran a headline. HOA decision to remove dam questioned amid flooding crisis. The article quoted residents calling for resignations. My name wasn't even mentioned. It didn't need to be. I was just the shadow in the corner, the patient observer watching the board sink into its own swamp. That's when the cracks widened. Carol resigned first, citing health reasons, though everyone knew it was because her own garage was still drying out and she couldn't stand the hate mail anymore. 2 more board members followed, claiming family obligations. That left Roland and one other diehard, clinging to their titles like life raft. But titles don't bail water. By week 3, the HOA's emergency fund was gone, drained by lawyer fees and cleanup costs. Residents stopped paying dues, arguing that they wouldn't throw money into the same pit that had already swallowed their homes. Without cash, the HOA couldn't enforce fines, couldn't hire contractors, couldn't even mow the communal lawns. Weeds sprouted knee-high, sidewalks cracked, and the pristine facade they worshipped crumbled like wet plaster. Through it all, I kept my hands clean. I didn't rebuild the dam. Not yet. I didn't sue. Didn't gloat. I just lived my life on dry ground, watching from the sidelines as the empire of clipboards and fines collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. One evening, Dennis showed up with a 6-pack and a grin. You should have seen it. They had a shouting match right in the street. Roland tried to order folks to pay extra dues, and Alan nearly decked him. I swear, it's like Lord of the Flies out there. I took a beer and raised it. To patience. He clinked his can against mine. To patience. But even patience has its rewards. About a month after the flood, the county sent me a letter. Not a threat, not a fine. An invitation. They wanted to meet about long-term water management solutions for the area. Apparently, the flood damage had drawn state-level attention. They needed a fix and fast. And who better to consult than the man whose dam had held the valley in check for years? I went to the meeting. Sat in a clean office with county engineers and state reps who actually understood hydrology. They asked questions, listened to my answers, and nodded thoughtfully when I explained how the reservoir controlled the seasonal surges. One of them leaned back and said, "We may need a permanent structure here. Bigger. Stronger. Something officially sanctioned." I smiled. You don't say. When I walked out of that meeting, I knew the war was no longer mine to fight. The HOA had destroyed my dam. The county was about to build something twice the size in its place. And best of all, the cost wouldn't come from my pocket. It would come from theirs. Tax levies, assessments, fees. Every homeowner in that subdivision was about to pay for the dam they demanded torn down. Call it karma. Call it justice. I called it patience cashing its check. But I didn't celebrate yet. Not out loud. Because if the HOA had taught me anything, it was that people drunk on control never give up without one last tantrum. And Roland still had breath in his lungs. The first survey stakes went in 3 weeks after the floodwaters receded. Orange flags fluttered along the creek bed, marking where the county's engineers planned to carve out the footprint of a new dam. Not my dam, not my money, not my problem. This one was official, sanctioned, and backed by more bureaucratic muscle than Roland could ever dream of. I watched them from my porch, coffee steaming in my hand, while neighbors muttered and gawked. Some cursed at the disruption, others cheered at the promise of protection. But no one cheered louder than me on the inside. For years they'd mocked my structure, fined me, sued me, branded me a menace. Now the government was building a bigger version in the same spot. The irony tasted better than the coffee. Roland, though, wasn't laughing. He marched down to the construction site like a one-man protest movement, arms waving, voice shrill. "This is overreach. This is unnecessary. You're destroying our property values." He shouted at anyone in earshot, engineers, reporters, even residents who dared to question him. The county foreman, a man built like a bulldozer himself, barely looked up from his clipboard. "Sir, you had your chance. You destroyed the only functional flood control in this valley. Now we're fixing it." Roland sputtered, red-faced, but his words bounced off hard hats like raindrops on steel. By the time the first bulldozer roared to life, Roland was a man shouting into the wind. His authority had evaporated with the floodwater, leaving only noise. I'd have pitied him, maybe, if he hadn't tried so hard to ruin me. But watching him stomp around like a general with no army, I couldn't help savoring it. The county's dam project became the talk of every porch, every grocery checkout, every church potluck. Some neighbors grumbled about the new assessment fees. Others whispered that maybe I'd been right all along. Nobody said it too loudly, but the shift was happening. The same people who once crossed the street to avoid me now nodded politely, as if admitting their silent regret was apology enough. Dennis came by with another six-pack, as he often did. "You should have seen Roland today," he said between laughs. "Tried to block the surveyors with his SUV. Cops had to tow him off like some kind of martyr." "Desperation," I said, cracking open a beer. "Smells the same everywhere. But desperation can still be dangerous." A week later, Ruth called me with a warning. "Roland's filed a countersuit. He's claiming the county's dam will devalue his property and that you colluded with officials to profit from it." I nearly spit out my drink. "Profit? From a dam?" "He's stretching," Ruth said. "But sometimes noise is enough to stall progress. And that was his last card, wasn't it? Noise. He couldn't stop the flood, couldn't stop the county, couldn't stop his neighbors from turning against him. But he could make enough noise to feel like he still mattered. The county swatted the suit aside like a mosquito. Still, it bought him headlines, a few minutes on the local news where he ranted about government tyranny and corrupt neighbors. The anchor nodded politely, the way people do when talking to a relative who's lost their grip on reality. The residents weren't so polite. At the next HOA meeting, the first in weeks, they tore into him. I wasn't there, but Dennis gave me the blow-by-blow. They shouted him down, man. Alan told him to resign before they voted him out. Some lady threw a soggy newsletter at him. He walked out before the vote even happened. And just like that, Roland was no longer HOA president. No title, no gavel, no podium to pound. Just another angry homeowner in water-stained khakis. But if you think that was the end of him, you don't know Roland. Stripped of power, he grew even louder. He started a Facebook group called Save Our Neighborhood, where he blamed me, the county, and even his fellow board members for the flood. He posted grainy photos of the dam demolition, twisting them into conspiracy theories about sabotage and collusion. A handful of diehards followed him, clinging to the illusion that he was their last line of defense. Meanwhile, the county's project pressed on. Bulldozers carved the earth, concrete mixers churned, and the skeleton of a new dam rose higher each week. Watching it take shape was like watching karma poured in cement. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. A letter slid under my door one morning, unsigned but unmistakably from someone on Roland's side. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of the county's construction schedule. At the bottom, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "He's planning something." I folded the letter carefully. My stomach didn't clench, didn't knot. I'd seen worse threats overseas. But the message was clear. Roland wasn't done. I kept my eyes open after that. Watched him more closely as he loitered near the site, phone in hand, snapping pictures like a spy. I noticed the way he lingered at hardware stores, buying tools he clearly didn't know how to use. I caught the look in his eyes when he passed my property, a mix of hate and desperation so potent it almost vibrated. Patience, I reminded myself. Don't move until he does. The storm that rolled in 2 nights later wasn't as fierce as the one that destroyed the neighborhood, but it was strong enough to test the skeleton of the new dam. Rain pelted the valley, runoff surged, and workers scrambled to reinforce the structure with sandbags. I was on my porch when I saw him. Roland, hood pulled low, flashlight bobbing in the dark as he crept toward the construction site. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with anticipation. The man was about to sabotage the one thing that could save the neighborhood, and in doing so, seal his own fate. I slipped on my boots, grabbed my phone, and followed at a distance. The rain masked my steps, the thunder muffled the sound. I watched as he clambered over a fence, lugging a crowbar awkwardly, like a child pretending to be strong. He swung at a generator, sparks leaping like angry fireflies. He kicked at sandbags, tore at tarps, tried to rip loose the steel rebar jutting from the concrete. It was clumsy, frantic, less sabotage, more tantrum. I dialed Ruth, then the county sheriff's office. My voice was calm, steady, the way it always is when things finally fall into place. You'll want to send someone down to the construction site. Looks like Roland's playing demolition derby with your dam. By the time the deputies arrived, Roland was soaked, mud-splattered, and screaming about tyranny. They dragged him out in cuffs while neighbors, drawn by the flashing lights, gathered in stunned silence. I stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in my pockets, watching as the man who once fined me $50,000 for protecting their homes was shoved into the back of a cruiser for trying to destroy the county's salvation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone this time. The next morning, the headlines didn't just question Roland, they crucified him. Former HOA president arrested for sabotage. His mugshot, wild-eyed and drenched, splashed across front pages and news broadcasts. Even his Facebook group went silent, followers vanishing like rats off a sinking ship. The county pressed charges. Felony vandalism, reckless endangerment, attempted sabotage of public infrastructure. Roland wasn't just humiliated, he was finished. Roland's arrest didn't just end his career in the HOA. It detonated the last bit of illusion that the board had any authority left. You can recover from bad decisions, even floods, but you can't recover from watching the man who fined your neighbor $50,000 get hauled away for trying to sabotage the very thing that might have saved you. The neighborhood changed overnight. The HOA, once a fortress of bylaws and clipboards, crumbled into irrelevance. Meetings were canceled. Newsletters stopped. The clubhouse sat dark, mold creeping up its walls, as though the building itself knew its reign was over. Dues dried up completely. Nobody wanted to write checks to an organization whose president was facing felony charges. Without money, the board couldn't even pay for lawn services or trash pickup. For the first time, their perfect subdivision looked like what it really was, a patch of houses clinging to a floodplain with no one steering the ship. Meanwhile, the county's dam project surged ahead, unbothered by the noise. With Roland gone, the protests vanished. Bulldozers groaned, cranes lifted rebar, and concrete poured day after day until the valley began to reshape itself. Each time I drove past, I felt the satisfaction of a man watching justice cast in stone. Neighbors started approaching me, cautiously at first. Some muttered apologies under their breath at the grocery store. Others stopped by my fence, offering awkward thanks. Alan, the man whose basement collapsed, showed up one evening with a six-pack and a sheepish grin. "Guess you were right," he admitted. I shrugged. "It's not about being right. It's about water not caring about your property values." We drank in silence, watching the sun dip behind the new skeleton of the dam. The lawsuits against the HOA multiplied. Insurance companies, residents, even contractors who hadn't been paid lined up to take their pound of flesh. Carol tried to distance herself, but subpoenas don't respect visors. Every board member who'd signed the demolition request was named. Their retirement funds, their savings, their carefully hidden accounts, all of it was about to be drained faster than their basement. Dennis, never one to sugarcoat, summed it up best one afternoon. They wanted control, and they drowned in it. I didn't disagree. The crowning moment came at Roland's trial. The county pressed the sabotage charges hard, and Ruth insisted I attend. Not because I needed to testify, I'd already given my statement, but because she knew what it would mean to see the man face consequences in front of a judge instead of behind a clipboard. The courtroom smelled faintly of damp paper and old wood. Roland shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists. His once square shoulders sagged, his face hollowed by weeks in county lockup. He tried to speak, to proclaim his innocence, but his lawyer silenced him with a hand on the arm. The evidence was overwhelming. Photos of the damage he'd caused at the site, eyewitness reports, even his own social media rants about stopping the government project. The jury didn't deliberate long. Guilty on all counts. When the judge read the sentence, 18 months in state prison, restitution for damages, permanent ban from any homeowners association leadership role, I didn't cheer. I didn't clap. I just sat back, let out a slow breath, and thought about patience. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. They wanted statements, sound bites, hot takes. I gave them none. I walked past silently, hands in my pockets, while microphones dangled like fishing lines desperate for a catch. The story played out on the evening news anyway. Local HOA president jailed after sabotage conviction. Anchors shook their heads, pundits tooted, and neighbors muttered. But for me, it was already over. Roland wasn't my problem anymore. He was the state's. The new dam finished construction in late summer. Bigger, stronger, more advanced than mine had ever been. The county held a ribbon-cutting ceremony, complete with speeches and local press. I was invited to stand with the engineers, but I declined. It wasn't my dam anymore. My role had ended the night I let them tear mine down. Still, I watched from a distance as the floodgates closed and the reservoir began to fill. The water gleamed under the sun, calm and restrained, a silent reminder of how fragile human arrogance can be when stacked against nature. The irony was perfect. Every homeowner in the subdivision was now paying extra assessments to fund the very structure they had demanded destroyed. Their monthly dues, once wielded like a weapon against me, were now shackles around their own ankles. They'd pay for the dam for decades, long after Roland's name faded into a punchline. Life settled into something quieter after that. The HOA, technically still existing on paper, became a ghost. With no leadership, no money, and no authority, it dissolved into irrelevance. Residents cut their own lawns, fixed their own fences, and managed their own dispute. Without fines and clipboards, the neighborhood became normal. Messy, imperfect, but livable. One evening, months after the trial, Dennis and I sat on my porch with beers in hand, watching the water trickle safely into the new spillway. "You played the long game," he said. I shook my head. "No. I just let them play themselves." He grinned, sunflower seed shells scattered at his feet. "Same difference." Silence settled between us, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The crickets chirped, the dam hummed in the distance, and for the first time since moving back, I felt something close to peace. The letters on my fridge, those old fines, those threats, those bold proclamations of power, still hung there, pinned under a trout magnet. Sometimes I'd glance at them, not out of anger but as a reminder. Paper burns, floods recede, titles crumble. But patience? Patience survives everything. I thought about Roland, somewhere in a cell, still muttering about tyranny and aesthetic. I thought about Carol, visor tucked away in some closet, praying nobody remembered her signature on the demolition order. And I thought about the dam, my dam, their dam, the county's dam. It didn't matter whose name was on it. The water didn't care. The water only respected walls that held. When I finally went inside that night, I looked once more at those letters. $50,000 in fines, bold as the day they arrived. And I smiled. Because the truth was simple, they hadn't cost me a dime. But the HOA? The HOA had bankrupted itself. Patience, I realized, isn't just a blade you sharpen. It's a flood you release at exactly the right time. And when it comes, there's nothing anyone can do but drown.